Humanity Matters.
Welcome back here to the Fogmore Humanity on HMTV. I'm here with Susanne Seperson, speaking about her family's unbelievable story during the Holocaust, at least the start of it, which we spoke about, with the war starting, Poland being divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, where her family was in the southeastern part, closer towards the Ukrainian border, kind of small villages, away from like the larger communities of Krakow or Warsaw, and basically the story of survival, right? Is that's probably, I would think, is the key word. And you were saying how your grandparents smuggled in tools,
my grandfather, yeah.
Your grandfather, and your mom gets pushed out of the train, right? And the goal was to get out and then go back to where they kind of came, away from wherever the train was going.
In the ghetto, they had her father had made a hiding place. So they said if anybody survives, they would go back to the ghetto. Now they could only move at night.
Yeah.
Long stories in between there, but it's just too much detail. So she went upstairs. It was pitch black. She hid in the. She said it was like a wall. They put a cabinet in front of a niche in the wall. And she sat there, and then she heard steps coming, and she was petrified, but it turned out to be her father. So they sat there figuring they'll wait till the next night, and now they hear more steps of the police, and one says to the other, two policemen, says to the other, I'm going to go up and see if there are any Jews up there. And the guy says, you don't have to. I was just here yesterday. This whole area is Judenfrei.
Wow.
So
what does that mean?
It means
Judenfrei?
Yeah, free of Jews. So instead of going up the 2 or 3 stories, he just stayed on the bottom, and left. And so they were able to hide. Had they been discovered, they probably would have been shot instantly. But because he turned around and said, no, I looked here yesterday. There's nobody here. They were able to survive that little episode.
When your mom jumps out of the train, is she on her own, or is she moving with other people that jump off?
No, well, at that point in time, she was alone, walking, in the snow. Another woman joined her that she didn't know.
And how old was she at that point?
Let me think. The war started.
Maybe
I would
14,
say no, she was older. The war started. She was 19. So there's the ghetto. So she must have been 21 at that point. 21.
Wow.
And ironically, the boys were jumping first, but the last boy got cold feet, and my mother was the first one online for the girls. He says to her, "Oh, you take my place. I'll go after you."
Wow.
She survived. He gets shot instantly and is gone.
Jeez.
That's where she said luck. Luck.
Yeah, the luck is, that's a tough word to say because it can go either way on
Absolutely.
you, right? And so now your dad, he gets off.
He escapes from the Janowska work /
Oh, so he doesn't get out of the train?
No, he's never taken to the train.
Wow.
He because it was an open ghetto and they had heard something. So he and his brother, they left before. They didn't get on the train. Their families did, but they never got on the train. They were going to hide out.
Wow.
Everybody thinking that the war wasn't going to last that long. But when he was in the camp, he got word, and bribery works everywhere. So he got word to his mother, and if I recall correctly from the story, Witold Monchak, who was the mayor's son nearby, he's the one who always brought her the word. He was the intermediary. So she went and gave him a shirt, which he used not for a clean shirt, but to twist it into like a rope.
What does he do in that work camp there? Do you know?
I don't really know. I know it was heavy labor.
Labor intensive,
but I looked.
Right?
I looked up, something about the Janowska prison camp, and they made munitions of some sort. I always had the feeling, and I did visit it, by the way. So I always had the feeling it was a quarry, but the more I've read, it was not a quarry. So, but it was heavy labor.
What part of Poland was that down where they lived?
Down where again, Janowska is near Lvov.
Okay.
So it's it's all on that border area. So at any rate, he used the shirt to twist the bars and pull them apart.
And that's a German work camp at that point?
Yeah, it must have been.
Yeah, because they're in control of everything.
Right. So he twisted the bars apart, pulls himself up to the little window, jumps out of the window, runs away, escapes, goes back to his village.
And he's the same age as your mother?
No, he's 6 years older.
Wow.
So that would make him about 27, 26, 27.
You know, age is something, because if you're a couple of years older, you have a little bit more experience, you can read people. And the one thing about your father, it seems like that he was able
smarts. He had
street smarts, but he was a very bright guy, but he was very tough.
Yeah.
And I'll always say that combination of being tough
and
being smart, right? You can kind of figure things out. And, you know, he might have picked up on things.
I don't know.
Almost like, my time here is done. I have to leave. You know, that this isn't, if I stay here much longer.
I could tell you stories about luck for him. Another farmer, you know, said he had his group of friends, and I have a picture of them. In fact, it's in the museum.
Sure.
And he said, you know, go hide in my barn and I'll bring you food. Well, we didn't know about these things in those days. And if you had a farm, you ate dairy. Well, obviously my father was lactose intolerant, and he vomited. Well, all the food that they had been given was poisoned. Everybody else but him was killed when they were told to hide in a barn. And
poison? Wow.
Poison, because I'm going to bring you food.
Yeah.
Okay? And they put poison into the food. But because my father was lactose intolerant, he vomited.
Wow.
Consequently, he looks around, everybody's dead. He runs out, you know, and he says, better get out of here because they're trying to kill me. So that's the luck. I mean, he didn't eat what they ate.
Yeah.
So
now he leaves from that work camp, right? It seems like heavy labor industry, something along those lines,
correct.
Right? Where does he go after that?
He goes back to his village, Oleszyce, where he gets help from the Fiutowski family. And they were the Christians who bought the property for the Bleibergs in the first place. And so he hid out in the woods for 6 years, or not quite 6 years, but, you know, 41 to 45, 4 years. Yeah. But the Fiutowskas, it's very cold out there. He said once a month he would come into our house, take a bath, get clean clothes, and get food.
Wow.
So and if anybody had found them, you know, helping Jews, not only would you be killed, your whole family would be killed. And when I used to teach a course on sociology of the Holocaust, you know, when I was a professor at Dowling before they closed, I always would say, I don't judge people, because would you put yourself and your whole family at risk?
Especially at that time, because the Germans are now penetrating so far into the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
It takes the Soviets about 3 years just to push them out of their own territory.
Correct.
You know, so people start realizing that the German victories are going so far. Mm-hmm. I mean, think about North Africa, right? They win in North Africa in 1942. They don't get done until, March of 1943. And then you have Sicily, and then Normandy's not until June 6, 1944. So there are these steps, but it takes time to defeat the Nazis.
Absolutely.
Even when they're getting defeated, it takes time for overall victory. And at that time, people are still getting killed, you know? And the fact that your father had almost like a little bit of a place of security, you know, where, he can bathe, you know, because guess what, right? You're out in the cold, you're out in the dirt. You know, sickness
you get
spreads.
sick, exactly.
Yeah, and then that's
exactly
it for you, you know.
And how many people, and I always say, that's why I don't judge.
Yeah.
And I judge the people who actually committed the crimes, never their children, never a group of people, never a category of people, because we're all individuals and we all make our own choices. And I would say, I don't know what I would do and all. Would I hide somebody in my attic, you know, that I would know would be wanted, knowing that I and my children could be killed? I don't know.
On the other side of this wall, I always forget his name, but he survived 18 days in Treblinka. I think it was 18 days. Eddie Weinstein, maybe?
Yes,
you know,
yes.
He looks like Christopher from The Sopranos.
Okay.
He looks exactly like Christopher from The Sopranos, right? And I used to bring teachers groups here in the early 2000s, right? For it was educational steps, you know.
Yeah. In service.
In service, graduate classes. So he escapes from Treblinka. They're cleaning out the trains of certain things, and other things are going back in. So they throw some bags in. One guy gets in, then they cover him. Then another guy gets in, they cover him, and then so on. And they smuggled money and weapons on there. He leaves the train. He goes back to his ghetto of Oleszyce. They see him with like a pen, with a gold point pen. And like, oh, you must have escaped Treblinka with all this money and you're wealthy and this and that. So he says to his father, he goes, we have to leave here. A day or two later, they take off. And like you said, some of the ghettos, you can walk in, you walk out.
They're open and closed ghettos.
Open and closed. So they go to a farmer, and they lived in I think it was a manure pile for over a year.
Oh, wow.
And then the farmer was giving them food and putting too much of one thing and not enough another to try to get them out, because I guess the security on them
Well,
was
they were
starting to weaken.
suspicious. Yeah, there were people, the neighbors were suspicious.
And everybody was watching, right? And then they went to a fish hatchery where one of the places there was no water. So there was a German Jew with them who was, I think he was a dentist. His name was Burl, I think his name was. And he always said, we're going to get caught, and it's going to be by kids. Kids are going to catch us. They're going to be playing, and they're going to unknowingly catch us. Yeah. So then there was a lot of pressure on, they called him the fisherman. And just like you said, like the pressure was so immense, but they did hide us, right? So you go from one stage to another, and then they built their own bunker in the ground. And at night, it was like kind of near a river, they'd get cleaned up. But what ended up happening was the Germans started retreating.
And
they could hear the tanks. So now they said, well, we want to work for you. And the Germans did not look at any ID cards. They didn't look at, because the Soviets were coming in. And they could hear them in German saying, these people are fools, right? He ended up fighting in the Polish army. He fought in Berlin. He came back. So now Jews come back to their property. People say, well, this isn't yours anymore.
Just what happened to
right?
my parents,
Okay, or we don't know who you are. They're playing dumb, right? So now they're sleeping somewhere, and somebody throws a grenade in there. And what does he say? We got to get out of here. And then they go to a displaced person camp. And he had a whole exhibit of where he lived. And I think he went back to Treblinka. There's a picture of him. I think at Treblinka, the monuments are stone of the different towns that the people were murdered from. And it was like the same thing, that your parents, like, you were fortunate to be there, but you don't know how long it's going to last, you know?
Well, that's what, when Monchak helped my mother get the false identity paper, she was going to go to Germany to be a worker.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, on the train from Yaroslav, heading towards Krakow and then changing.
She was denounced, right?
She was, one of her classmates, identified her as a Jew on the train, and she was pulled off just before the Krakow station.
Yeah.
And she always says, had she been identified closer to her hometown, she would have been shot instantly.
Wow.
Because it was closer to Krakow, she was pulled off and put into the Jewish prison in the Krakow ghetto.
In the ghetto.
And then when they broke up that ghetto, she was the last person to be put on a truck to be taken to Auschwitz.
Jeez.
And she had a number and a tattoo. And the ironic thing, she had like I said, she was a petite woman. She had an upside down triangle under her number. And that showed that she was a dangerous prisoner because she tried to escape. And when I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., once that was built and they had all the books and so on, they had transport this to this. And since she was the last girl on the truck, her number it's not she was between this number and that. Her exact number is listed in the transport list as, yes, we took her, because people were property. We took her, from where she was, to Auschwitz. And then, of course, by the time that the Germans were losing the war, they wanted to
So she was actually imprisoned in Krakow?
In the Krakow, yes. And then when they broke up that ghetto, she was sent to Auschwitz. And she worked there. Once again, she said she was very lucky because she started out, they had to hack stones to build latrines. So she wasn't going to last long, that way. But she got taken to the place called Canada, which was, quote, the good place.
Yeah, that was all the clothing and everything, right?
Because that's where they took the prisoners' stuff that they were allowed to take with them, sort them, clean them,
Inventory,
and so on.
right.
And it was indoors. And remember, it was cold.
Sure.
So, and she got lucky because even among all the horrible people there, the SS Frau, who was in charge of her group, she knew when the, Mengele or others were going to come by and do, she would keep her crew out overnight so that they wouldn't be there for the selection for the next morning.
Wow.
So even amongst all this misery.
So where would they send? They just say stay in your barracks?
No. They left the barracks to go work in a factory. So they were let to where Canada was.
They just left completely almost.
Canada was a separate part.
Yeah.
And so they remained overnight in Canada as opposed to coming back to their barracks. That way, when they had the selection in the morning,
they weren't there.
They weren't there. And it was, the SS Frau said, I need them. And she always said, I have good workers. I don't want to start with new ones. They're not troublemakers. We'll keep them out. So that let her avoid the possibility of selection when they were doing the selections, and so again, and then once they started breaking up the camp, then she went to a different camp, to Mährisch Weisswasser, which is actually Whitewater, that was in Czechoslovakia.
Birkenau was where.
So there were different parts of Auschwitz.
Yeah.
So she was in Auschwitz, Birkenau, and then there was some other Buna. There were different sections, but she worked in Birkenau.
And that's where most of the killing facility was, right?
When I went there, I didn't delineate. I saw all the different places. I saw the crematoria. They knew that everybody was being killed, and that whole thing that we didn't know, that excuse is so BS.
Yeah,
because you could smell it.
It was in the first
time. The first time I went was in the late 1990s. I went with my mother and daughter. It was the very first time. That's a whole separate story. But they still had open trenches, and so you could smell it when 50 years later, you're walking by the road and you could smell it. You could see the dirt was an unnatural color.
It's the toxins of death.
It was horrible. It was just horrible.
The man who liberated Warner Reich was down in Lower Manhattan like 2 weeks after 9/11. And he goes, that same smell that I smelled going into Mauthausen from a mile away.
Wow.
Like you can't put your finger on it, but it's just not a normal smell. He goes, I smelled that in Lower Manhattan. And it came back, the war came back
to him. Wow.
And it's something.
Chills.
So your mom ended up going back there?
Well, after the war and the Mährisch Weisswasser, and then the war was over and the guards, everybody disappeared.
Sure.
So the Czech people were much better, even though she worked in a munitions factory. And
when your mom goes back to Auschwitz.
No. Before we get back to Auschwitz, they just disappear. So they take the train and they go into Prague.
Yeah.
And in Prague, there are all sorts of lists, who's going where and looking for each other. So then she ends up in Poland. She meets her father. She meets her father and my father, from the same town and so on. And then they come to the United States. Now, the first time we went back to Poland, I had gotten a grant. So my mother didn't want to go, but I said to her, look, I got a grant. I want to, document everything. And so that was in the late 1990s. And that's when she found the Fiutowskis and she found Monchak. And there were these amazing reunions. And she was petrified. In fact, she has the number. She wouldn't wear any short sleeves because she didn't want, she didn't know what the reception would be. And anyway, we can go on.
So now Auschwitz gets liberated by the Soviets in January of 1945. Most of the camp gets pushed out. There are some people that are left behind for whatever reason, right? Sick, elderly, maybe too slow to catch up, whatever the Germans wanted out of there at that point. What happens with your mother?
My mother had already, when this camp started breaking up, she was sent to this other camp in Czechoslovakia called Mährisch Weisswasser. So that was just as it was breaking up a little bit before. And she said conditions were better because the local people, they'd bring in an apple or an extra something so they weren't starving.
Yeah.
And so she wasn't there for the actual entrance of the Russians into the camp.
And then how is your mom there for the rest of the war, or does she go somewhere else after that?
No. Once the Germans surrendered and there were no more guards, the guards
Yeah.
disappeared. They threw off she got on the train to go into Prague,
Wow.
and the International Red Cross helped her, find other people and get resettled.
And then she maneuvers from there, right? Where does she go back to? Does she go
She goes back to her own town
in Poland?
In Poland, she gets word through different relatives, and then she almost got killed, because people thought they were coming back to their property. But anyway, she meets her father, who wants to go back to the town. But they ended up, the Fiutowskis gave them clothes and money to be able to leave, and so they start heading
And that's
west.
a journey.
Oh,
She's
it's
going from
huge. Yeah.
Czechoslovakia towards the opposite end of Poland now,
Yeah.
right? And so now, where's your dad?
He,
When does he realize that he survived the war? Is when the Soviets come back in, right?
That's an interesting question. Somehow he must have gotten word that the war was over, because he was hiding out. Maybe Monchak or the Fiutowskis told him. And so when he left, he was just told to go west.
Yeah.
And they must have known. I actually have the...
Like Bernie's father, he waited. It was almost like, because he uses like the example that people were putting food and clothing out, and it took months for people to trust that it was all right to come out in the open. It was all right to trust these people,
Right.
and
But
and that the Nazis were gone.
I know my mother and father met again in Poland. That much I know. And I guess when they all decided they were going west, they ended up in Bayreuth. They knew somebody in Bayreuth. It was actually, I got a lovely letter from him a long time ago, obviously. Say he ended up being in Bayreuth and saying he was an outstanding citizen, and, blah, blah, blah. So they were going to go to Israel. I think I told you that.
Yeah, sure.
And then the war broke out there. My mother said, I'm not going. And here's you think the story ends. It does have a happy ending, but they are living in an apartment, and it's very icy and snowy, and you can't walk on the sidewalk. They walk in the street, and a big truck comes. And the long and the short of it is my mother gets hit by the truck.
Wow.
So she ends up in the hospital, and she has amnesia. So my father ends up taking care of her, and it took a while. And, she ultimately obviously comes to, and in the interim, I'm born.
Wow.
So that's how I was born in Germany. So they're there. My father in the
Your parents
meantime-
didn't have it easy in any case.
Right. So then they're there, and he's, doing some business and so on. And then they decide they're coming to enough of the war, enough of hardship. They're coming to the United States. And so, as my mother says, the good news is they came to the United States. As she would say, she had a daughter, and she became a grandmother and a great grandmother. And
When you were younger, you're a young girl in the Bronx, right? Did your parents talk about their experiences? I mean, because your mom's got the number on her arm.
Right.
After a while, as a kid, you pick up on things with your parents, right?
She did not want me to be upset about being Jewish.
Yeah.
That was one of her big concerns. So when I asked her about the number, and I would say 2, 3, 4 years old, she would say, a bad man gave me the number. That was the sum total of a bad man. Now, they were very quick, like I said, they wanted to be Americanized. So my mother took a couple of English classes, or
Sure.
her father, just to get
Assimilate,
over. As
right.
she would say, I used to go to the 5 and dime store, to Woolworth, just to look at different things and talk to the sales lady, to practice my English, and to do things of that sort.
Cultural things here,
Exactly.
right?
But many people, they were called, and I guess it's somewhat derogatory, the greenhorns. And so
Yeah, it's my mom from Ireland was a
okay.
greenhorn. Yeah.
So, I knew a lot, and most of them survived from Siberia, and they were much more religious than my family was. So they ultimately, I always knew when they had their, what I call their European friends as opposed to their American friends, and they were very happy to be much more Americanized. But because my father escaped, when he met with his buddies from way back, the stories I overheard was like, we got them, those bastards, we escaped, And so they were, I'll describe them as heroic stories. But my mother, they would always say, and my first language was German, which became kind of a bastardized Yiddish, they would say, don't talk to her in that language. You're American now. Put the past behind you.
Sure.
So she didn't have that same circle, to vent with. So on the one hand, Jews were victims, which is what I heard growing up all around me, which didn't quite square with how I knew my parents. I mean, they fought every way that they could under the circumstances, as opposed to victims, as opposed to heroes. And so one of the things that always bothered me is people will say, oh, the Jews were led to slaughter like sheep. And I was saying, no, because even my father, on his side of the family, everybody was very long-lived in those days. And one of them was in his mid-90s, and they were making them carry the bags and walk to the... And he said to my father, if I were your age, I'd never let them take me alive.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm 90-something. I don't have a choice. But I would... And my father would always say, I would fight to the death. I mean, and that is really a mentality of you fight back. You don't just take it. And frankly, I'll just tell you, asked me about growing up in the Bronx. I had one friend who was born in Germany. That was it.
Yeah.
Everybody else was American. And there was one kid a boy who was a couple of years older than me, and for some reason, I was an easy target. And I would come home crying because I wasn't taught to fight or anything. And
Sure.
And my father said to me, he said, straight in the eye, the height-wise was just right. He said, just take your fist and give it to him.
Yeah.
Well, I gave it to him where it really hurts.
Yeah.
The kid went running and he never bothered me again. So, sometimes you have to fight back. That's it.
In terms of survival, learning from your parents is... Right? They could tell you a thing or two, right?
Yep.
So, all right. So we're going to come back with Susanne for a third episode here on the Fog of War and Humanity. And come right back with us.
If you enjoyed exploring the information, history, and stories in today's conversation, be sure to check out our other podcasts here on HMTV. Please subscribe, share, and stay connected for more engaging conversations.
Humanity Matters.